my husband texted to say he was working until 11. At 7, I stopped by to bring him dinner and found him with my sister-in-law sitting on his lap. I turned around quietly and went home to do something that would leave my husband's family in ruins. My name is Sarah, I'm 36 years old, and I work as a bookkeeper for a local construction supply company. I married at 29, an age when you're no longer dreaming of fairy tales, just hoping to find a decent man to build a quiet life with. My husband, David, is 2 years older than me and works as a plant supervisor at a manufacturing facility. When we first met, he wasn't the overly sweet type, nor did he know how to whisper the flowery words that make women swoon, but he was steady, didn't party much, and always spoke with a calm deliberation. It was that very composure that made me believe a life with him would be free of storms. After the wedding, to save up for a down payment in a crazy housing market, I moved in with his mother, Carol, into her 2-story house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. From the outside, my husband's family wasn't wealthy, but they were the picture of middle-class respectability. My mother-in-law was a woman who prized appearances above all else. Everywhere she went, she loved to be complimented on her tidy home, her well-behaved sons, and her dutiful daughters-in-law. My husband, for his part, had a familiar refrain. "All that matters is keeping the peace at home," he would say, "winning arguments is just tiring." It sounded nice, but after living with him for a while, I understood. More often than not, keeping the peace didn't mean preserving happiness. It meant one person had to stay silent, had to swallow every bit of resentment so that everyone else could be comfortable. My husband's family also included his younger brother, Kevin, and his wife, Jessica. Kevin was 3 years younger than David, a real estate broker with a fiery temper, a massive ego, and a love for showing off. He was gone from dawn until dusk. One day, it was a client dinner, the next a trip out of state, the day after that, drinks until the early hours. My mother-in-law always defended him, saying a young man has to hustle to make money in this economy. All I saw was a man who lived recklessly, with no regard for his home and even less for his wife. Jessica was the complete opposite. Nearly 7 years younger than me, she had fair skin, a slender frame, and a soft-spoken manner. Her smile was always a shy, sweet thing, as if she'd never known how to be angry at anyone. After just over a year of marriage, she had quickly won over my mother-in-law. She was polite to everyone, her words as sweet as honey. Every morning in the kitchen, she would wrap her arm around Carol's and whisper, "Mom, I'm so clumsy. Please be patient with me and Sarah." It sounded endearing, but strangely, whenever it came to actual work, she had a clever way of stepping back. I cooked breakfast, I cleaned up lunch, and I handled the planning for holidays. I reminded my mother-in-law to take her medication, I entertained relatives when they visited. Even changing a light bulb in the hallway or keeping track of everyone's birthdays and holiday dinners fell to me. Jessica always found a way to stand aside yet still be praised. She knew to carry a bowl of salad back and forth a few times, to bring out a plate of fruit just when someone was watching, and to say a few sweet words to please the elders. That was enough to be considered a good daughter-in-law. There were times I felt a pang of unfairness, but I would tell myself to let it go. Young people are like that now. I was the older sister, so giving in a little wouldn't hurt. Besides, what daughter-in-law avoids comparison? As long as my husband understood, that was all that mattered. But honestly, the thing that saddened me most wasn't doing more work. It was that doing so much had become an expectation. No one saw my efforts anymore. On the surface, David was still a considerate husband. He didn't drink to excess, gamble, or yell at his wife and children. But he had a type of coldness that was hard to bear. Every time I felt hurt, he would say, "You're overthinking it." Every time I complained of being tired, he would say, "Just let it go, we're family. Why turn small things into big problems?" Before I could even finish voicing my frustrations, he would cut me off with that same, flat tone. So, for years, living in that house, I grew accustomed to swallowing my feelings. For a time, I genuinely pitied Jessica because her marriage was so troubled. Kevin barely paid attention to his wife. Some nights he came home after midnight, other times he'd be gone for 2 or 3 days. He answered his phone when he felt like it. Jessica would often sit next to me in the kitchen, sighing as she snapped green beans. "You're so lucky," she'd say. "David is always so calm and thoughtful. But my Kevin. I feel like a stranger in my own life." Hearing her talk like that, my heart would soften. I even defended her to my mother-in-law and told my husband that if Kevin and his wife were having problems, the family should step in, so the new bride wouldn't feel so alone. At the time, I had no idea that the thing I pitied was a seed of disaster, already planted in my own home. Because, gradually, I started to notice things, small things, that left a persistent feeling of unease in my heart. Jessica had a habit of calling my husband David in a way that wasn't normal for a sister-in-law. Whenever she needed a favor, she would draw out his name, give a little laugh, and look directly into his eyes, as if trying to create an intimacy that crossed a line. David, could you look at the garbage disposal for me? David, do you know how to fix this app on my phone? David, can you help me pick which of these colors looks better? They were all ordinary requests, so small, so easy to dismiss as me overthinking. But it's strange for a woman, sometimes, you feel the sting before you see the thorn. I kept telling myself not to think the worst. Because once a woman starts down the path of suspicion, every glance, every smile, every casual word can become a needle. I was afraid of becoming a paranoid, petty woman who saw malice everywhere. I tried to push it away, to believe that Jessica was just young and thoughtless, and that my husband was, and always had been, a man who knew his boundaries. But the more I tried to dismiss it, the more this small, unsettling feeling grew. It wasn't clear enough to be called fear, certainly not enough to cause a scene. But it lingered, like a hair caught in my throat, not painful enough to choke on, but impossible to swallow. And from those days on, I began to pay more attention. I just never imagined that the tiny crack I saw in what I thought was a stable home would one day tear everything apart. But if it had stopped at just a vague feeling, perhaps I could have continued to deceive myself for a while longer. Because women are often like that. We see something wrong but cling to the idea that we're just imagining things to help ourselves sleep at night. I had been like that. I had forced myself to go back to how things were before, telling myself that living so closely together was bound to create a heightened, unfounded sensitivity. But the more I tried to believe that, the more the events that followed became impossible to label as mere coincidence. The first real suspicion arrived on a Saturday afternoon. I came home from the grocery store earlier than usual because the cashier warned of a heavy storm coming. As I opened the back gate, I saw Jessica standing close to the patio sink, leaning forward slightly. David was standing right behind her, his head bent very near to hers, his hands fumbling with the ties of her apron at the nape of her neck. I froze for a beat, not because the action itself was so egregious a casual observer might think it was just a brother-in-law helping out, but what stopped me was their reaction. Jessica didn't startle or step away like someone mindful of propriety. She just giggled, her voice a coquettish purr. "If you don't untie this, I'll be stuck here all day." It was only when my husband looked up and saw me that he recoiled as if he'd been burned. I walked onto the patio, still holding my grocery bags, my face a carefully composed mask of calm. Before I could say a word, Jessica spoke first, a quick, bright smile on her face. "Don't get the wrong idea," my hair got caught. It was that very phrase, "don't get the wrong idea," that I would never forget. Because an innocent person doing an innocent thing doesn't usually rush to proclaim their innocence. I just grunted in acknowledgement and walked straight into the kitchen. But for the rest of the afternoon, the image of them standing so close together on the patio played over and over in my mind. A few days later, something else happened. I was hanging laundry on the clothesline in the backyard when I heard laughter from the driveway. Looking out, I saw Jessica getting out of the passenger seat of David's truck. She was holding a small paper bag from a pharmacy, and my husband was leaning against the driver's side door, telling her, "Next time your stomach hurts, just ask Sarah to take you. Don't be shy." I hadn't even had a chance to feel relieved when Jessica curled her lip into a sweet smile and replied with a sentence laced with sugar. "I'm just afraid of bothering her. I feel so much safer when you're the one helping me." The way she said it, the way she looked up at my husband's face, sent a small but sharp pang through my gut. I went outside immediately, trying to sound as normal as possible. David quickly explained that on his way home from work, he had conveniently stopped to pick her up from the urgent care clinic because Kevin was busy with clients. It sounded reasonable, very reasonable. But what I couldn't swallow was something else. Why hadn't Jessica called me when I was at home? Why had she called my husband first? A sister-in-law who was truly considerate would, at the very least, think about avoiding any potential for gossip. Instead, she chose the one person who could easily cause a misunderstanding. And then to say, "I feel so much safer with you," right in front of me. I still said nothing. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, but from that day on, a small thorn was lodged in my heart, and every time I touched it, it hurt. Then, during a family dinner, I truly saw how terrifyingly thin the line between carefree and crossing a boundary was. That evening, as we were all eating, Kevin's phone rang. He scowled, listened for less than a minute, then put his bowl down and stood up to leave, tossing back only one sentence: "A client called, I'll be back later." Jessica remained at the table, her face sullen, her lips pouting like a forgotten child. Before I could even glance her way, I saw David place a piece of chicken on her plate, his voice low but clear. Go on and eat. If someone doesn't care about you, you have to care about yourself first. Just think about that. Is that something a brother-in-law should say to his sister-in-law? On the surface, it sounded like a simple, comforting phrase, but it was precisely because it was so fitting, so gentle, so intimate, that it was dangerous. I was the only one at the table who heard something deeply wrong in that sentence. My mother-in-law was busy talking about the neighbors. Kevin was already gone. And Jessica, she looked up at my husband, a quick glance, but it was long enough for me to see that her expression was no longer that of a sister-in-law being consoled by her brother-in-law. It was the look of a woman who felt herself being caressed right where she was most vulnerable. That night, lying next to my husband, I couldn't sleep. I closed my eyes, but the memories kept replaying. Jessica asking him to fix her phone. Jessica asking him to give her a ride to the store. Jessica calling him to check a faulty wire in her room. I even remembered a time she held up 2 dresses in front of the mirror and turned to my husband, asking, David, which color do you think looks better on me? At the time, I only found it slightly annoying, still thinking she was just being naive. Now, connecting the dots, I realized it wasn't naivete. It was a gradual testing of boundaries, an inching forward, step by step, so that by the time anyone realized what was happening, things had already gone too far. I had wanted to confront him, to sit him down and demand an explanation, but I knew David's personality all too well. If I asked without concrete proof, he would immediately snap that I was being paranoid, that I was scrutinizing his own sister-in-law. And Jessica would surely cry. Her eyes would well up, she would talk about how misunderstood she was, and she would paint me as the difficult, narrow-minded sister-in-law who saw filth everywhere. In the end, I would be the one the entire family looked at with disapproval. So, I chose silence. Not because I was weak, and certainly not because I was stupid, but because, from that moment, I began to understand something. If there was indeed something sordid happening quietly in that house, the one who rushed in would be the one to lose first. I needed to see more clearly, to remember more carefully, to let them expose themselves further. Because only when the truth revealed itself would I not be turned into the accuser in the very home I had worked so tirelessly to build. After those encounters, I no longer saw things in that house with the same eyes. I still went to the market, cooked meals, did laundry, went to work, and came home on time, just as before. On the surface, nothing had changed, but inside, I was completely different. I began to pay closer attention, not in the overt, snooping way of a jealous woman who has lost all reason, but with the memory of a woman who has lived long enough to know that betrayal never arrives in a single, sudden shock. It reveals itself in dozens of tiny, off-key moments, so small that if you weren't already hurting, you would never notice. I realized my husband had started to care more about his appearance. When we were first married, David was the type of man who didn't fuss. For work, anything would do, and when he got home, he'd toss his shirt on a chair, wash his face quickly, and sit down to eat. But lately, on the days he said he had to work late or had a sudden meeting with a client, he was different. His shirts were more carefully chosen, his hair was neatly styled, and he even stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. One day, while I was folding laundry, I saw him spray cologne twice. I casually asked, "Just for work, and you're so dressed up?" He gave a flat smile and replied with a single sentence, "It's an important client. If I look sloppy, they won't respect me." It sounded plausible, but the more I heard it, the less it felt true. Jessica had changed too. Before, at home, she always wore loose-fitting sweats, her hair tied back, and walked around with the tentative air of a new bride. But recently, her style was completely different. Even just lounging around the house, she started wearing thinner fabrics, lower necklines, and her hair wasn't in a tight bun but tied loosely at the nape of her neck. Whenever she walked past where my husband was sitting, she would slow down by half a step, just enough for the scent of her perfume to waft over and linger. There are things a man might not notice, but a woman knows instantly, not because I was overly sensitive, but because some changes only happen when a person wants to be noticed by someone specific. One evening, I was washing dishes when Jessica's phone rang on the dining table. The screen lit up in the dim kitchen, and 2 short letters hit me right in the eyes. D. I froze, my hand still in the water, and stared for a moment. Before I could read anything else, Jessica burst out of her room and snatched the phone so quickly she knocked a spoon to the floor. She gave a forced laugh, her voice a little strained. "Oh, it's the delivery guy." But then she turned her back and walked into the hallway to take the call, her voice dropping to a whisper. Her panicked reaction wasn't that of someone getting a normal phone call. It was the reaction of someone terrified of being seen. That same night, my husband also took his phone out to the balcony for a long time. I lay in the bedroom, listening to him pace back and forth out there, his voice sometimes a low murmur, sometimes silent. When he came back in, I asked casually, as if I didn't care, "Who was that? You were on the phone for a while." He answered immediately, almost without thinking, "Just work stuff." It was too quick, too smooth. That kind of answer wasn't meant to explain, it was meant to shut down any further questions. I turned away and didn't ask again, but a coldness settled in my heart. Some statements sound so normal, and the more normal they are, the more terrifying they become. Another day, I opened the refrigerator to get some water and saw a container of homemade brownies, placed neatly on the top shelf. I knew for a fact I hadn't baked them. I had been busy with end-of-month accounting. I was exhausted when I got home, just making simple dinners to get by. When my mother-in-law saw me holding the container, she said right away, "Jessica made those." She said she wanted to make a treat for the whole family. I nodded, but when I looked closer, I saw something that made my heart sink. Next to the smaller, family-sized pieces in the container was one larger brownie, cut from the corner with extra walnuts, with a small sticky note on the plastic wrap. For David. Just think about it. What sister-in-law bakes a special portion of dessert for her brother-in-law and even takes the time to write his name on it? I picked up that brownie, my hand feeling ice cold, but I still said nothing. I just put it back, closed the refrigerator, and walked away as if I hadn't seen a thing. That evening, just as I expected, my husband opened that container and ate that specific brownie. He even praised it in front of the whole family while he was eating. "Jessica, you're getting much better at baking than when you first came." Jessica lowered her head and smiled, but the corners of her mouth turned up in a way that was very clear. It wasn't the joy of being complimented on her cooking, it was the look of someone who had just received validation from the very person she was trying to impress. But all of those previous incidents, as unsettling as they were, didn't hurt me as much as what happened on that rainy afternoon. I was on my way to work when I suddenly remembered I had left a ledger at home. It was drizzling, so I turned the car around to get it. As I walked into the living room, I saw Jessica sitting on the floor, and David was squatting in front of her, holding her ankle as if he were rubbing ointment on it. When they saw me, Jessica immediately pulled her leg back, her face flushing. My husband shot up, speaking quickly. She slipped on the wet patio. I glanced at the tube of icy hot on the table. It was just a normal tube of pain relief cream. If she had really just slipped, no one should have reacted with such panic. But they both avoided my eyes. Jessica quickly pulled her pant leg down, and my husband stood partially in front of her, as if to shield her from my gaze. The way they scrambled in what should have been a harmless situation was what made me feel a lump in my throat. I didn't scream, I didn't throw things, and I didn't interrogate them like a wife catching them in the act. I just looked at them and said one sentence. "Next time you're hurt, call your own husband. Don't call someone else's by mistake." That sentence made the entire room freeze for a few seconds. My husband opened his mouth as if to say something but then fell silent. Jessica just stared at the floor, her ears bright red. I didn't wait for an explanation. I turned, picked up the ledger from the table, and walked straight out the door. The entire drive to work that day, my heart felt as heavy as a stone. It was from that moment that I knew I could no longer lie to myself. I knew something was going on. I just didn't know how far it had gone, how sordid it was, or how many people in that house were truly innocent. But one thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't make a scene yet. It wasn't the right time. Because if everything was still just fragmented pieces, and I went in biting and scratching, the one who would end up looking like the crazy one would be me. So, I chose to swallow it. Swallow it to see more, swallow it to remember better. Swallowing it not because I was a coward, but because I was beginning to understand that for some humiliations, to repay them properly, you have to wait for them to expose themselves in the light. That Friday afternoon, as I was finishing up the final figures at the office, my phone buzzed. A text from David appeared on the screen, as brief as always. "I'm working late tonight, probably won't be home until 11. You and Mom go ahead and eat." Just one line, nothing special. Not a single word to cause alarm. And yet, I stared at it for a long time, so long that even I found it strange. The longer I looked, the colder I felt, as if a woman's intuition was pulling me by the hair toward a truth I didn't want to face. When I left work and drove home, that cold feeling didn't go away. The house itself felt strange that evening. Kevin had packed a bag in the afternoon, saying he was taking clients out of town and might not be back until the next day. He said it in a rush, just a few words, then sped off. Jessica came down for dinner early but only picked at her food, looking pale. She kept rubbing her temples, complaining of a headache, and asked to be excused to go lie down. My mother-in-law just nodded without asking any questions. And I sat at the dinner table, looking at my husband's empty chair, then at the empty seat of my sister-in-law who had left her half-eaten meal to go upstairs. Suddenly, everything felt like it had been perfectly arranged. A house where, on the very night the husband says he's working late, the younger brother is away overnight, and the sister-in-law has a headache and goes to bed early. I could no longer tell myself it was just a coincidence. The more I thought about it, the heavier my heart became, but instead of sitting there guessing, I decided I had to do something. I went into the kitchen, opened the rice cooker, and took out a container. I quietly packed a separate portion of dinner for my husband. I wasn't doing it because I was still blindly in love with him, nor was I trying to play the role of the devoted wife one last time. I was doing it because I needed a legitimate reason to go to the place he claimed he was working. I needed to see with my own eyes. After all the signs, all the overlapping suspicions, I didn't want to live another day in a state of half-belief and half-doubt. Some pains are better dealt with a single, clean cut than 1,000 tiny scratches that you don't know when will finally draw blood. While I was quietly packing the food, my mother-in-law, sitting in the living room, called out casually, "Poor David, he's been so swamped with work lately, leaving early and coming home late every night." I paused, the lid of the container in my hand. I looked up and saw her peeling an orange, her expression unchanged. I suddenly wondered, does she really not know anything? Or is she just living by the principle that as long as no one says it out loud, everything is fine? But I didn't ask. I just gave a faint smile and went back to tying the bag securely. After I finished, I did one more thing. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked up toward Jessica's room on the second floor. Her door was slightly ajar, the light was off. It looked as though she was really resting, but her beige house slippers, the ones she always wore, were not outside her door as usual. That small detail made my hand clench the handle of the food bag until it hurt. Maybe she had already left. Or maybe she was never in her room to begin with. Just the thought of it made my throat tighten as if I had swallowed a sharp bone. I left with the bag of food around 7, just as it was getting dark. The wind outside was chilly against my face. The whole way there, my mind was flooded with small fragments of memory. The way Jessica stood so close to my husband on the patio. The sugary sweet tone she used when she said she felt safer with him. The container of brownies with the note that said, "For David." The phone screen that lit up with the letter D. My husband's hand on her ankle in the living room. Each incident, on its own, could be denied, could be explained away, could be twisted into a sign of my own paranoia. But when they were all connected on a dark Friday night like this, they became a rope, pulling me straight toward a cliff. Many times on the way, I wanted to turn back. I thought, what if I get there and find nothing? What if it's all just a huge misunderstanding, and I've just humiliated myself with my own ugly suspicions? But then another thought surfaced. If I turned back now, how much longer would I have to live like this? A week, a month, or until my entire being rotted away from doubt, still too afraid to face the truth? No, if I was going to do this, I had to see it through to the end. For a woman to properly settle a debt of humiliation, she must first have the courage to look her own humiliation straight in the face. When I arrived at the gate of David's company, my heart was beating so fast I could hear it in my ears. I parked my car, got out, and walked toward the entrance with the container of food. The security guard, sitting on a plastic chair by the gate, smiled when he saw me. "Oh, Mrs. Miller, you're here to see David?" I forced a smile and asked the one question that felt like a rock in my throat. "Is David still working in his office?" The guard looked at me, puzzled for a few seconds, then answered casually. "Everyone went home early today, ma'am. No one's working overtime tonight." When I heard those words, my ears started to ring. All the surrounding sounds, the traffic on the street, the chirping of crickets, even the guard asking me something else faded away. That answer was no longer a suspicion. It was like a pair of scissors severing the last thread of self-deception I had been clinging to. But I still went inside. I didn't turn back. I had come this far, I couldn't allow myself to be a coward for one more step. If I didn't see it with my own eyes tonight, I would probably spend the rest of my life wondering if I had wrongly accused them. And I didn't want to carry that question with me for the rest of my life. I walked up the stairs to the second floor. The hallway was dark, except for one office at the far end with its light still on. My heart pounded so hard I thought the people inside could hear it. Each step I took felt like I was stepping on something soft and painful inside my own chest. As I got closer, I heard laughter, A man's low, suppressed laugh, as if trying to be quiet. Then a woman's soft, sweet reply. I stood frozen outside the door. I didn't need to see their faces, I recognized their voices immediately. One was my husband, the other was Jessica. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that no matter what I saw when that door opened, I would never be able to go back to being the woman I was before. I stood outside that door for a few seconds that felt like a lifetime being crushed in my chest. My hand, still holding the warm container of food, clenched so tightly it hurt, but my body was ice cold. I didn't push the door open right away. I just leaned in slightly, peering through the small gap where the door wasn't fully closed. And then, I saw it. To this day, I remember every single detail. So clearly that if I close my eyes, it all comes back, as fresh as a new knife wound to the heart. Under the cold, white light of the office, David was sitting in the swivel chair by his desk. And Jessica was sitting directly on his lap, her arms wrapped around his neck, her hair cascading over his shoulder like a woman long accustomed to such intimacy with that man. It wasn't just standing too close, it wasn't an accidental touch, it wasn't the kind of ambiguous situation where I could lie to myself that I was mistaken. She was on his lap, her arms around his neck, the kind of closeness that only a cheating man and woman share when they are certain no one is watching. I felt a ringing in my ears. The figures before me were no longer my husband and my sister-in-law. They were two people, tearing apart everything I had spent years trying to build, to preserve, to endure. The deepest pain wasn't just that my husband had betrayed me, but that he had betrayed me with the very woman who called me sister, who sat at the same dinner table with me every day, who had played the part of the fragile victim, so that I had once pitied her, defended her, and opened my heart to her. I could hear Jessica's voice clearly. She rested her head on my husband's shoulder, her tone sickeningly coy. You keep telling me to wait, but I've been waiting forever. How much longer are you going to let me suffer like this? My husband, the man who had told me that family should live with integrity, that one should always think before they act, raised his hand and stroked her hair, consoling her like a true lover. He replied in a low voice, but clear enough for me to hear every word. Just be patient. Making a scene now will only hurt us both. That sentence was like a dagger straight to my heart. So, it wasn't a one-time mistake, not a moment of weakness, not something that had just started a few days ago. They had been together long enough to have conversations like that, long enough to know how to hide it, long enough to plan their next steps. And I, the woman who shared his bed, who had slaved over every meal, every pill for his mother, every towel and shirt in that house, turned out to be nothing more than a fool, placed squarely in the middle of it all without a clue. I had once thought that if this day ever came, I would charge in. I would kick open that door, I would slap that woman across the face, I would throw the hot food container at my husband and demand to know why. I thought I would cry, I would shake, I would scream so the whole company would know what kind of despicable people they were. But strangely, when I saw it with my own eyes, I did nothing. I didn't barge in, I didn't make a sound, I didn't even drop the container in my hand. Perhaps when pain passes a certain threshold, a person no longer reacts in a normal way. It doesn't erupt into fire, it freezes into ice. I stood there for a few more seconds, just long enough to see David lean down as if to kiss her hair, just long enough to see her hand grip his shoulder like she was holding onto a familiar anchor. Then I quietly stepped back, closing the door to its original position without making a sound. Walking down the stairs, my mind felt terrifyingly clear. I knew that if I had rushed in then, what I would have received would not have been justice. They would have been startled, then they would have cried. Jessica would have covered her face and claimed she was wronged. My husband would have said it was just a moment of foolishness. And if my mother-in-law found out, she would have undoubtedly used the honor of the family to crush me, forcing me to swallow it all one more time to keep the facade of her family intact. No, I didn't want a cheap, dramatic scene only to end up being painted as the hysterical, out-of-control wife who caused a disturbance at her husband's workplace. I also didn't want to give them an opportunity to deny, to cover up, or to turn everything back on me. If I was going to suffer this much, I had to make them pay a worthy price. Not just the two of them, but also anyone who might try to cover for them. By the time I got to my car, I couldn't remember how I had walked past the front gate. I only know that when I placed the food container on the passenger seat, I looked at it and felt a bitter, ironic laugh build inside me. The food was still warm, the soup I had made still smelled fragrant, but the man I brought it for was busy embracing another woman. My care and attention suddenly felt humiliatingly absurd. I started the car and drove home, my heart as empty as if a large piece had been carved out of it. When I got home, I got out of the car as usual, parked it as usual, and walked in as usual. My mother-in-law was sitting on the sofa. The moment she saw me, she looked up and asked, "Did you find David?" I took off my shoes, placed my keys on the table, and replied in a steady voice, "I dropped off the food for him." I was surprised myself that my voice didn't tremble, didn't crack, didn't betray a single thing. It was calm to the point of being cold. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the darkness for a long time, listening to the ticking of the clock, each tick feeling like someone was slowly grinding a dull knife in my chest. Near midnight, I opened a desk drawer and took out an old notebook I used for household expenses. I flipped to a blank page and began to write everything down. From the afternoon on the patio, to the ride from the clinic, the comment at the dinner table, the phone call with the letter D, the brownie with his name on it, the icy hot on that rainy afternoon, and even the words I had just heard in that brightly lit office. I wrote slowly, clearly, as if afraid that if I missed a single detail, my humiliation would be twisted by others into a different story. The more I wrote, the more I felt a part of me die completely. I was no longer the wife who could only feel pain and cry. From that moment on, I began to be the one who collected each piece of the truth, fitting them together into a trap, tight enough, strong enough, and painful enough that when it sprang, no one in that house would be able to hold their head up as a decent person ever again. And before the sun came up, I took my first step. I picked up my phone and quietly sent a text to someone my husband's family would never expect. Not to cry, not to complain about how miserable I was, but to begin a plan. A plan that had to be calm, meticulous, and ruthless. Because from that night on, I understood with perfect clarity that some marriages cannot be saved, some betrayals cannot be forgiven, and for some families, if you want them to show their true colors, you must not scream too soon. The next morning, I woke up at the usual time. I still measured the rice, made the oatmeal, fried the eggs, and heated the kettle for my mother-in-law. I still opened the back door to air out the kitchen, set the coffee maker, and laid out the bowls on the table as if nothing had happened. Perhaps even I was surprised that after a night of seeing my husband holding my sister-in-law on his lap, I could be so calm. But only I knew that this calm was no longer the endurance of before. It was the first layer of armor I wrapped around myself to begin setting my trap. David came down for breakfast later than usual. As soon as he sat down, he glanced at me several times. Quick, darting looks that couldn't hide his probing. Perhaps he was trying to figure out if I had really gone to his office last night, if I had seen anything, or if there were any unusual signs on my face. But I just ladled oatmeal into a bowl, pushed it in front of him, and said in a steady voice, "Eat it while it's hot." He picked up his spoon, silent for a few seconds, then asked casually, "You got home late last night?" I didn't look up right away. I finished chopping some chives and then answered lightly, "I stopped by to bring you dinner. The security guard said you had stepped out, so I came back." Just that one sentence. The teacup in his hand paused for a beat. A tiny, almost imperceptible pause. If you weren't watching his every breath like I was, you wouldn't have noticed. But for me, that was enough. Enough to know that he was starting to get scared. Jessica also came down late that morning. She was wearing a turtleneck, her hair tied back neatly, and she avoided my gaze completely. But it was her very attempt to act normal that made her seem all the more repulsive. She sat down and forced a smile, as if she were an actress who had forgotten her lines. "Sarah, I had a headache last night, so I went to bed early. I still feel tired this morning." I turned to look at her and smiled, the perfect smile of a knowing sister-in-law. "I see. You went to bed so early, but you still have dark circles under your eyes. You must be really exhausted." The moment those words left my mouth, the atmosphere at the table soured. My mother-in-law looked up from me to Jessica. David immediately interjected, asking his mother about her arthritis medication, trying to steer the conversation in a different direction. I quietly put food in my own bowl, and said nothing more, but in my heart, I knew. From that moment on, I was no longer the betrayed wife waiting for someone's pity. I had become the thorn lodged right in their side. A small thorn, but sharp enough to make them feel it with every move. I began my first plan with something very simple, to make them think I was only vaguely suspicious, that I didn't know anything for sure. I didn't interrogate them, I didn't snatch their phones, and I didn't make a scene in front of everyone. I just observed more closely, remembered more carefully, and intentionally appeared at times they least expected. Some fears don't come from screaming, but from the unnerving feeling of not knowing just how much the other person knows about your filth. That afternoon, when my mother-in-law went to a neighbor's house, I rummaged through an old cabinet in the storage closet off the kitchen. Inside was a mini camera I had bought a while back to watch the back door after our coffee maker was stolen. I had used it for a while, and then forgotten about it. Luckily, it still worked. I wiped off the dust, plugged it in, and saw the indicator light come on. A cold resolve settled over me. I quietly changed the Wi-Fi password and, when no one was paying attention, I mounted it in a corner of the storage closet near the back staircase. It was a spot no one ever looked at, but it connected the second floor to the back of the kitchen. If anyone tried to sneak through there, I would see it. I didn't stop there. I also started paying attention to David's phone. Not by grabbing it like some desperate wives, but by noticing the small things. What times of day was he online the most? Did his brow furrow, or did his lips relax when he texted? He took his phone with him to take out the trash, he took it into the bathroom. One night, it buzzed very softly. He startled and turned his back completely to me before daring to look at the screen. I had seen these things before, but because I still trusted him, I had ignored them. Now, I collected them, and every single one became a piece of evidence. The opportunity I was waiting for came sooner than I thought. One afternoon, I deliberately asked my mother-in-law to go to the pharmacy to get a refill for her blood pressure medication, and I called my office to take the afternoon off, claiming a headache. I closed my bedroom door as if I were resting, but I was actually hiding behind the kitchen door, waiting. The house was quiet for a while, and then Jessica came downstairs. She was wearing a thin house dress, her hair down, walking so softly as if afraid of being heard. She didn't go out the front door or into the kitchen, she went straight into David's home office. About 3 minutes later, David came in from the backyard and followed her inside. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands ice cold. I thought I would burst in and kick the door down, but in the end, I remained still. I just turned on the voice recorder on my phone. First, I heard the sound of a chair moving, then Jessica's choked voice. "I can't take it anymore. How much longer are you going to make me live like this?" Then came David's voice, low and tense. "I already told you, if we want this to work out, you have to let me handle it. If she finds out everything, this whole family will explode." I listened, and my insides felt like they were being twisted into knots. So, there was nothing left to doubt. They weren't just having a secret fling. They were planning a future together. They saw me as an obstacle that needed to be removed at the right time. That evening, I got into bed next to my husband as if nothing had happened. I turned my back to him, pulled the blanket up to my shoulders, my eyes wide open in the darkness. A moment later, David unexpectedly placed a hand on my shoulder. It had been a long time since he had initiated contact with me in such a tentative way. His voice was softer than usual. "Have you had a lot on your mind lately?" I lay still for a few seconds, then replied very softly, but each word felt like it was being pinned to the mattress. "Yes. I was just thinking about how some things look clean on the surface, but are actually rotten on the inside." His hand withdrew immediately. The room was deathly silent. No one said another word. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to keep myself sharp. Because I knew with absolute certainty that from that night on, the first tripwire had been set. And once a wire is pulled taut, sooner or later, something has to snap. After what had unfolded in the preceding days, I began to see something very important. People who are doing something wrong, if they haven't been completely exposed, will always live in a state of being half scared and half reckless. And it is that very state that is the easiest to break. I didn't need to make a scene. I just needed to push them into a corner where they would trip over their own lies. I continued to play my part in the house. I still woke up early, cooked, went to work, and spoke to my mother-in-law as usual. But I started to change the way I spoke to Jessica and David. I no longer avoided them, no longer remained completely silent. Instead, I started making comments that were half joking, half serious, enough to startle the listener, but giving them nothing to accuse me of. One morning, as Jessica was standing in front of the mirror adjusting a new dress, I walked past, glanced at her, and casually remarked, "If you wear something like that and run into the wrong person, you could easily cause some trouble." She spun around to look at me, her face visibly paling, but I had already bent down to pick up a basket of laundry, as if my comment was just a random, thoughtless warning from an older sister. It was the lack of explanation that frightened her. At lunch that day, I deliberately brought up a story I had read online a few days earlier. As I served the food, I said very naturally, "I just read an article about a family that fell apart because the husband was having an affair with his own sister-in-law. Living under the same roof and daring to do something so immoral. It gives me chills, just thinking about it." My mother-in-law, hearing this, scowled, her voice sharp. "Don't bring such filthy stories to the dinner table." I smiled faintly and nodded. "I hope our family never has to deal with that kind of thing." The moment I finished speaking, there was a soft clatter. David had dropped his fork. Jessica stared down at her plate, her ears bright red. Only Kevin kept eating, occasionally swearing under his breath as he got a text from a client canceling a deal. His obliviousness only confirmed one thing for me: he didn't know anything yet. And when he did, things would spiral out of anyone's control. I didn't stop at words. I started showing up at times they didn't expect. One night, I pretended to wake up to use the bathroom. But I was actually hiding in the shadows of the upstairs hallway. I waited, and just as I thought, Jessica's bedroom door opened very quietly. She was barefoot, her steps as light as a cat's. A few seconds later, David's door also cracked open. I didn't watch any further. I turned away before they could spot me. But the camera I had installed by the back stairs had recorded everything. Two shadows meeting in the night. I didn't need to see their faces to know what they were doing. The next morning, I went down to the kitchen earlier than usual. When Jessica came down, she was walking with a slight limp. I glanced at her feet and said casually, "Where did you go last night? Your feet are all dusty." She flinched, quickly tucking her feet under her chair. David, sitting next to her, immediately jumped in, his voice a bit sharp. "She just went to the kitchen for a glass of water. What's the big deal?" I looked up at him and smiled faintly. "I wasn't asking you. Why are you in such a hurry to answer?" The atmosphere at the table grew thick. My mother-in-law looked from one person to the next, but said nothing. I just continued to eat as if nothing had happened. It was that very calmness that unsettled them. They didn't know how much I knew, what I had in my hands. From that day on, David began to change noticeably. He could no longer maintain his usual calm demeanor. If I said anything even slightly suggestive, he would become irritable. One day, I asked a very normal question about his work, and he snapped. "Why do you ask so many questions?" I looked at him without responding. I understood perfectly well that his aggression wasn't because of me, it was because he was scared. The breaking point came one afternoon when it was just the two of us at home. David closed the bedroom door, turned to me, and his voice was cold. "If you're trying to imply something, just say it. Stop with all the hints. It's exhausting." I looked him straight in the eye, for the first time not looking away. Only people with something to hide are afraid of hints. An honest person has nothing to fear. He stood there for a few seconds, his lips pressed into a tight line. I saw him swallow hard, then he turned away abruptly without another word. In that moment, I knew I had hit his sorest spot. And when a person's sore spot is touched but they haven't been exposed, they are even more likely to make a mistake. Sure enough, that very night, the camera recorded something even more important. In the back kitchen, David cornered Jessica, his voice low and tense. "Stay away from me from now on. She's starting to suspect." Jessica didn't back down. She looked right at him, her voice a mix of bitterness and hurt. "You're scared, aren't you? Are you afraid of losing your wife, or are you afraid of losing your precious, respectable image?" That question sent a chill down my spine. That woman was no longer the weak, clinging one. She had started to make demands, to want more. And when a secret affair reaches that point, it can't stay balanced for long. I sat in my room, rewatching the recording, my hand clutching my phone. It was then that I truly understood this was no longer a simple case of two people having a fling. This was a relationship with ties, with dependencies, with a power struggle. And the longer it went on, the more likely it was to explode. I closed the screen and took a deep breath. At this point, I could no longer just stand by and watch. I needed a stronger impact, something big enough to pull everyone in that house out of the fake, normal shells they were trying to maintain. And this time, I wouldn't just target the two of them. I would pull this entire family into the vortex. Because some things, if you only expose them partially, people can still find a way to deny them. But if you flip everything over, there's nowhere left to hide. That evening, after rewatching the footage of David being cornered by Jessica, his voice filled with panic, I knew I couldn't just be an observer anymore. If I let things continue to leak out bit by bit, they would soon cover their tracks, change how they communicated, and go back to playing their roles perfectly in front of me. I needed to light a fire, carefully. Not so big that it would erupt immediately, but hot enough to make everyone in that house start to crack from the inside. The perfect opportunity came quickly. Thanksgiving dinner. The house was busy from the morning, with relatives coming and going, some arranging platters of food, others setting out centerpieces. On holidays like this, my husband's family always tried to maintain an image of order and propriety. Everyone had to choose their words carefully, smile just enough, and carry themselves with respect. That's why I knew that just one well-placed sentence would be enough. No one would dare make a scene right away, but inside, each of them would be roiling. That morning, Jessica and I were in the kitchen prepping the meal. She was quieter than usual, not bustling around or chattering sweetly like before. I looked at the white nape of her neck, exposed beneath her hastily tied hair, and I felt a mix of disgust and dark amusement. Some people think they're so clever when they're on top, but the moment they're seen through, their true cowardice is revealed. As I was arranging bowls on a tray, I suddenly turned to her and asked very quietly, my voice like a confidential whisper between sisters. It's hard being a woman, isn't it? The worst thing isn't marrying the wrong man. It's falling in love with another woman's husband. The ladle in Jessica's hand clattered to the floor, splashing soup onto her pants. She shot up, looking at me, her face as white as if someone had just choked her. I bent down, picked up the ladle, placed it back in her hand, and continued, my voice still perfectly calm. Why are you so shaken? I was just talking. She didn't reply, just stared at the floor, her lips pressed tight, her hands trembling so much she almost dropped the bowls again. I turned away and continued arranging the food as if nothing had happened. But I knew that sentence had burrowed into her mind. She wouldn't be able to stay calm any longer. And I was right. Throughout the family gathering that day, Jessica lost her usual quick-witted charm. She flinched every time someone called her name and answered questions half a beat too late. At one point, while carrying a teapot, she almost bumped into an uncle. My mother-in-law shot her several annoyed looks, then her eyes darted to me, as if trying to gauge something. As for David, his tension was palpable. His face had been as taut as a violin string all morning. He was curt with everyone and gripped his coffee mug so tightly it looked like he might break it. Around noon, when the meal was ready and the family was gathered in the main room for refreshments, I dropped my second piece of bait. I waited until everyone had finished eating and was relaxed. Then I gave a small, wry smile and began to tell a story as if I had just remembered it from online. A few days ago, I read about this woman who discovered her husband was cheating on her with his own sister-in-law. It all came out because of hotel receipts and some voice recordings. It's just chilling to think about. A few of the older aunts, who were sitting and chatting, looked up. I continued, my voice slow and deliberate, enunciating each word. They said when it all came out, it wasn't just the marriage that ended. The younger brother took a knife and tried to kill his own brother. Some things are so filthy, you don't just lose your home, you lose your whole family. The moment that last sentence was out, it felt like someone had thrown ice water on the room. Kevin, who had been scrolling on his phone at the edge of the room, looked up and sneered. That kind of guy deserves to have his legs broken. Hearing that, David's hand slipped, spilling coffee onto the table. Jessica's face was drained of all color, her eyes darting to him before quickly looking down again. My mother-in-law said nothing, but her gaze started to shift back and forth between me, David, and Jessica. It was then I knew she had sensed something, even if she didn't dare to name it. That night, the fire I had lit in the morning truly began to catch. Near midnight, after everyone had gone to their rooms, I heard arguing from Kevin and Jessica's room. It wasn't their usual bickering. It was a genuine roar. Kevin slammed something against a table and yelled so loudly I could hear every word from the hallway. Who are you seeing? Jessica, through sobs, screamed back. You're gone all the time, you don't care if I live or die. What right do you have to ask me anything? Kevin swore repeatedly. I heard his foot stomp on the floor, while she just cried, her sobs interspersed with hiccups as if she were the most wronged person in the world. I stood in the hallway, my back against the wall, my heart cold. The fire I started had caught, but what stopped me was my mother-in-law's reaction. She ran out of her room, but she didn't slap her daughter-in-law or ask for the full story. She pulled Kevin aside and hissed, her voice low but sharp. Be quiet. The neighbors will hear everything. It was the way she cared more about what the neighbors heard than the fact that her son's marriage was imploding in the middle of the night that sent a strange pang through my heart. Something about her reaction wasn't like someone who had just found out. It was like someone who had smelled the rot for a long time and had just been stuffing a cloth up her nose to avoid naming it. The night wasn't over. Around 1 in the morning, after the hallway had fallen silent, I saw my mother-in-law's door creak open. She called David downstairs. The two of them stood in the living room, speaking in low voices, almost whispers. I couldn't hear full sentences, only fragments that drifted up the stairs. You need to end this. Don't let Kevin find out. And finally, one more mistake, and this family is finished. That was enough to make my blood run cold. So, I understood. My mother-in-law wasn't blind. She knew, or at least she suspected so strongly she could no longer lie to herself. But instead of stopping her son, instead of upholding the most basic morality in her own home, she chose to cover it up, to patch things over, to preserve the respectable facade of her family. That truth elevated the story in my mind to a much more terrifying level. I was no longer just facing two cheaters. I was facing an entire family willing to bury decency to save face. I went back to my room, locked the door, and opened every video, every audio file, every note I had saved. Sitting in the dark, I looked at them and saw everything connecting into a clear line. And that night, I made a new decision. I wouldn't just expose the affair. I would make it explode right in front of the one person who needed to see it most. Kevin had to be the one to witness it. Not hear it, not be led to it, but see it with his own eyes. Only then would this family have no way to cover it up. After that night, sitting alone in my room, I finalized my plan. If I wanted this whole charade to be torn to shreds, the first person to see it had to be none other than Kevin. I began to wait for the right moment. I couldn't be reckless or impatient. A poorly timed strike would only give them a chance to deny, to patch things up, and to turn around and brand me as the jealous, home-wrecking wife. I had to choose the right day, the right time, the right circumstances so that when the curtain was pulled back, no one involved would have a way out. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. That weekend, David announced to the family that he had to go to the plant in the next county to inspect a shipment and might not be back until late. Kevin, meanwhile, ate dinner with his face buried in his phone, then tossed out a curt statement. "I'm meeting clients tonight, probably late." I sat there listening, still serving vegetables to my mother-in-law, but my eyes never left Jessica. And just as I predicted, the moment she heard that both men in the house would be out, a fleeting look of anticipation crossed her face. If you weren't watching closely, you would have missed it. But I saw it clearly. It wasn't the look of a sister-in-law about to enjoy a quiet evening. It was the look of a woman who knew she had a date. I started my preparations that afternoon. First, I borrowed my mother-in-law's phone, claiming my battery was dying. I secretly found Kevin's number and sent him a single, short text. "Mom's not feeling well. Come home early after you're done." I deleted the message immediately and returned the phone as if nothing had happened. After that, I texted David myself, using the tone of a wife who still trusted her husband. "I'm going to a friend's birthday party tonight, probably won't be back late. If you finish work late, you can just stay at a motel near the plant. Don't bother driving all the way back." I sent these two conflicting messages to make both sides let their guard down. One thought he had a free evening, the other thought I wouldn't be home. And I was in the middle, waiting for them to walk into the trap. As evening approached, just as I had anticipated, Jessica began to get ready with unusual care. She changed out of her house clothes and into a soft, cream-colored dress, washed her hair until it was fragrant, and applied a light but noticeable shade of lipstick. My mother-in-law, sitting in the living room, glanced at her and asked nonchalantly, "Going somewhere tonight?" Jessica smiled as sweetly as ever. "I'm just going to a girlfriend's house to chat. She's having some husband troubles." Carol didn't ask any more questions. Her silence was both chilling and contemptible. Some mothers aren't stupid. It's just that when evil touches their own child, they would rather play blind than be decent. Around 7:30, I left the house with my purse, as if I were really going to a party. But I didn't go anywhere. I parked my car at the end of the street, circled around to the back of the house, and slipped into the storage closet next to the kitchen. In my hand was my phone, with the feed from the camera under the back staircase already open. I sat there in the dark, my knees pulled to my chest, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it myself. The closet was damp and cool, with the musty smell of dried onions and old wood. But at that moment, all I could see was the glowing screen in my hand. Around 8 o'clock, David came home. He didn't go upstairs, didn't call for his mother, and didn't turn on the lights in the main part of the house as he usually did. The moment he came in the back door, he walked straight toward the kitchen, like a man with a prearranged meeting. 2 minutes later, Jessica also slipped in. She didn't come from the front but from the side of the house, creeping down the hallway. Her hurried steps, the way she glanced around, said it all. Then, right before my eyes, at the bottom of the back staircase, those two people embraced as if they couldn't bear to wait another second. There was no more ambiguity, no more furtive glances or suggestive words. This was a real embrace, a real kiss. David's hand gripping Jessica's waist as if she had always belonged to him. I could hear Jessica's trembling voice, half reproachful, half pleading. "I've waited long enough. How much longer are you going to push me away?" David breathed heavily, his hand stroking her back, his voice low and tense. "Just a little longer. I'll talk to Mom, but first, we need to make Kevin file for divorce himself." Hearing that, I felt as if someone had plunged my head into ice water. So, they weren't just sleeping together. They were planning to push Kevin out of the marriage so they could be together openly. They intended to turn a neglectful husband into the one who was left, fabricating a story about incompatibility so they could move on as innocent victims. The depravity of it made me so nauseous, I had to bite my lip to keep from making a sound. I immediately called Kevin. The moment he answered, I forced my voice to sound as panicked as possible. "Kevin, Mom collapsed. Get home right now." He swore on the other end, then snapped, "What do you mean, collapsed? Where are you?" I answered quickly, "I'm at home. Just get here now." He hung up. I looked back at the screen. David and Jessica were still oblivious. They were arguing about whether to go public yet. The more they talked, the more their selfish, calculating natures were exposed. But just when I thought the curtain was about to be ripped away in front of Kevin, something unexpected happened. The kitchen door burst open. My mother-in-law stood there, frozen for a few seconds, then lunged forward like a madwoman. She yanked Jessica away from David, her voice a fierce whisper, careful not to be heard outside. "Are you two insane? Do you want to destroy this entire family?" David spun around and hissed, "Mom, stay out of this." Jessica covered her face and sobbed. "I can't live like this anymore, sneaking around." I was frozen in the darkness. My final suspicion was confirmed. Carol knew. Not just recently, but she knew enough that catching them wasn't a shock, only a panic that they would be exposed. The three of them stood there, none of them able to maintain their normal facade. A trio of conspirators, cornered. It was dirtier than I had imagined, colder than I had imagined. At that exact moment, the sound of Kevin's motorcycle skidded to a halt outside. I knew there were only seconds left, but my mother-in-law reacted with terrifying speed. She shrieked at David to run upstairs, then dragged Jessica into the storage closet next to the kitchen. It all happened so fast, I couldn't get out in time to pull Kevin to the scene. When he burst through the door, all he saw was his mother, clutching her chest and panting for breath on a kitchen chair, and a house that was eerily silent. My first trap hadn't been a complete success. But in its place, I had seen something even more disgusting than the affair itself. I saw a family united in covering it up, in hiding the truth, in pulling each other down into the mud while still trying to hold their heads high and speak of family values. And in that moment, I understood with perfect clarity. The next strike could not be a half measure. When Kevin burst into the house, my mother-in-law had indeed patched things up in an instant. Carol sat on a chair by the kitchen table, one hand on her chest, the other gripping the edge of the table like someone who had genuinely just had a health scare. Jessica emerged from the storage closet, her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes red as if she had been crying out of concern for her mother-in-law. David appeared a few moments later, walking down the stairs, his face pale but his voice steady. "What happened to Mom?" To an outsider, it would have looked like a family that had just gone through a frightening ordeal. But I was standing right there, in the very kitchen where I had just witnessed the three of them frantically hiding their secret, so I saw right through the act. It was too fast, too coordinated, too clean, and the more they tried to appear clean, the more they reeked of filth. Kevin threw his motorcycle helmet onto a chair and rushed over, his questions tumbling out. "Mom, are you okay? Who called me?" I stepped out from the back hallway at that moment, feigning surprise as if I had no idea what was going on. "Oh, I thought Mom was really sick, so I called you. I guess she's feeling better now." As I spoke, I let my gaze sweep over each of them. My mother-in-law avoided my eyes. Jessica bit her lip, her hands twisting the hem of her shirt. And David stood frozen, his expression darkening. It was the first time I had seen genuine fear on their faces. It was no longer a question of whether or not I knew. They knew I was holding something. They just didn't know when I would use it. Kevin asked a few more questions, but his mother quickly cut in, saying it was just a dizzy spell and she was fine now. She had only called him for reassurance. He stood there, his eyes darting around the kitchen, looking at his mother, his brother, his wife, and then me. I knew his mind was a tangled mess, but he hadn't yet found a thread strong enough to pull. And that was exactly what I needed. That night, after everyone had gone to their rooms, David came into ours as I was closing the door. He no longer had the tentative, probing tone of the past few days. He grabbed my wrist, his grip light but firm enough to betray his agitation. His voice was a low, threatening whisper. "What game are you playing?" I yanked my hand away and spun around to face him. In all our years of marriage, I had never looked at my husband with the expression I had that night. "I'm playing the game that every betrayed person has to play." Opening my eyes to see the truth. His face hardened. His jaw clenched, his nostrils flared. He stood there for a few seconds, then asked slowly, as if struggling not to shout. What do you know? I gave a humorless laugh. It was so cold, it startled even me. Enough to know you're dirty, but not enough to see you ruined. You know, some men, when their masks are ripped off, don't feel shame. They just feel anger at being seen. David was one of them. The moment I finished speaking, he slammed his hand on the table. For the first time in his life, he pointed a finger at my face and yelled, "Don't push me." I laughed out loud, a sound that echoed in the room, and made me shiver. I'm the one being pushed. You and your little sister-in-law have been pushing me to live with your filth every single day. And now you ask, who's pushing whom? Just that one sentence made his face go pale. Because he finally understood. I was no longer just suspicious. I knew. I knew enough to touch the most disgusting part of what was between him and Jessica. But what I found even more repulsive was that instead of apologizing, instead of begging for forgiveness, instead of feeling the slightest bit of shame in front of the wife who had been with him for so many years, David revealed the most selfish part of his character. He lowered his voice again, his words a clear threat. If you have any consideration for this family, you will keep your mouth shut. If this gets out, Kevin will tear this house apart, my mother won't survive it, and you won't get anything out of it except the reputation of a woman from a family of adulterers. I listened, feeling a mix of disgust and dark amusement. Even at this point, all he cared about was the family, the reputation, his mother's image. Not me. Not the humiliation I was enduring, not the years I had wasted in that house. They had betrayed me, and now they wanted me to be the rag to clean up their mess. I didn't argue further. I just looked at him for a long time and said very slowly, "You're wrong. The moment I saw you holding her, this family was already broken. We just haven't heard the crash yet." With that, I turned my back, got into bed, and lay down. I knew that from that moment, the real battle had begun. There was no turning back, no room for pity or hesitation. I didn't sleep that night. As David lay with his back to me, his breathing heavy like someone who had just survived a panic attack, I quietly sat up, opened the drawer, and took out my phone and notebook. I gathered everything I had, the camera footage of them in the night, the audio file from the office, the records of their trysts in the back kitchen. The timeline I had meticulously kept. Even the detail of my mother-in-law hiding them. I made 2 copies of everything, one saved on my devices, one I sent to a secure cloud account. In case something happened, I couldn't afford a single mistake. Because at this point, one misstep, and they would crush me with the same methods they had used to silence me. I did one more thing, small but crucial. Around 2 in the morning, I sent a text to Kevin, a seemingly random sentence. If you have some free time, you should pay more attention to your wife. Some things, once they're lost, you can't get back. After sending it, I put my phone down, my heart still pounding. He read the message about 10 minutes later but didn't reply. I knew that a man with an ego like his wouldn't just let that go. He would start to wonder, and once he started wondering, he would start digging. At the same time, across the hall, my camera feed showed Jessica cornering David in the dark. Her voice was no longer sweet, it was a tense, impatient hiss. "You keep making promises. If you don't choose, I'll tell everyone myself." David gritted his teeth and grabbed her arm so hard she stumbled. "Shut your mouth. Once this blows up, do you really think you'll have a place in this house?" Watching them on the screen, I realized they were no longer a pair of secret lovers whispering in the dark. They had become 2 bombs, tied together, just waiting for the right moment to detonate. I closed my notebook as the sky began to lighten. A single thought was crystal clear in my mind. The next blow couldn't be just an argument in the kitchen or a fight in the bedroom. It had to be a situation that no one could deny, that no one could cover up. And the one who would be hurt the most had to be the one who deserved it the most. I knew I was just one step away from the final climax. And this time, I wouldn't let my mother-in-law hide them, and I wouldn't let my husband escape. After that night, after I sent that short, cryptic text to Kevin, the atmosphere in the house changed completely. It was no longer the oppressive, simmering tension from before. It was a palpable stress you could see and hear in every person's breath. Kevin stopped rushing out early and coming home late. He started to be home for dinner more often, sitting silently in the living room for hours. Most importantly, his gaze changed. It was no longer the distracted, annoyed look of a man obsessed with money and his ego. It was the look of a man who was suspicious, who was scrutinizing every move his wife made. Jessica sensed this change quickly. Her anxiety became obvious. Before, she would move with a certain flirtatious grace, her words always sweet. Now, if Kevin looked at her for too long, she would scowl, turn away, and find an excuse to go upstairs or to the kitchen. Her constant state of being on edge only made her more suspicious. As for David, he was becoming more and more frazzled. He avoided me. He was wary around Jessica. And with his brother, he tried to act so normal it became awkward. From the outside, the house still had 4 people sitting at the same dinner table, but on the inside, each of them was holding a bomb, just waiting for it to go off. I didn't say much more to Kevin. I knew that with a man like him, being direct would only backfire. He might even think I was trying to manipulate him. So I just dropped short, timed comments, just enough to be unsettling. One time, I was hanging towels on the clothesline when I saw him leaning against the doorframe, his eyes fixed on Jessica, who was on the phone on the second-floor balcony. I didn't look at him. As I shook out a towel, I said, as if to myself, sometimes, outsiders see things first. It's the people on the inside who choose to be blind. I heard him grunt softly behind me, but he didn't ask anything. It was his silence that was so terrifying, because it meant my words had taken root in his mind. The next evening, I pushed things a step further. While clearing the dinner table, I intentionally left my phone behind, with the video of the 2 shadows embracing under the back staircase open on the screen. The clip was only about 10 seconds long, with no clear faces or sound, just 2 figures wrapped tightly together in the dark. To an outsider, it might not be enough. But for a husband already consumed by doubt, it was more than enough to start a storm in his head. Just as I had planned, Kevin picked up my phone, probably to call me over, but he froze. I was standing in the kitchen, watching through the crack in the door. He stared at the screen for less than 10 seconds, but his face changed completely. His jaw tightened, his hands balled into fists, and veins bulged on his neck. When I walked out, he quickly put the phone down, pretending he hadn't touched it, but his eyes were bloodshot, as if someone had poured fire into them. I didn't ask. I just picked up my phone, turned off the screen, and continued wiping the table. My silence drove him crazier. From that night on, Kevin stuck to Jessica like a shadow. He watched where she went. When she came out of the shower, he sniffed her clothes. When she texted, he would walk past, his eyes darting to her screen. If she placed her phone face down on the table, he would pick it up and ask who had called. One night, I went out for a glass of water and saw a crack of light from their bedroom door. Inside, the glow of a phone screen illuminated Kevin's tense face. He was pretending to be asleep, but he was watching her. Jessica, for her part, was getting increasingly agitated, her words to her husband becoming more and more sarcastic. Once, in the back kitchen, I overheard her hiss into the phone at David. "This is all your fault. You kept telling me to wait, and for what? To be buried alive in this house?" David was truly in a bind. On one side was me, who knew too much. On the other was Jessica, who was losing control and constantly pressuring him to make a choice. And then there was Kevin, whose suspicions were now real. He tried to maintain a calm exterior, but the more he tried, the more it showed. One night at dinner, his mother asked him a simple question, and he snapped. "Mom, can you just leave me alone?" Another day, he came home from work, saw the ceiling fan was on too high, and slammed the remote on the table in frustration. The man who had always been so deliberate with his words was now like a pressure cooker about to explode. My mother-in-law, seeing the escalating tension, began to play her role as the firefighter. One afternoon, she called me out to the back patio, where she kept her potted plants. She stood with her arms crossed, her voice low, and no longer evasive. When a husband and wife have problems, they should sort it out behind closed doors. Don't turn a small issue into a big one. I turned to look her straight in the face. In all my years as her daughter-in-law, I had heard every kind of lecture about duty, but never had it sounded so cheap. I asked slowly, enunciating each word. "What small issue, Mom? The one where your daughter-in-law is sleeping with both of your sons?" Her face went pale, her lips twitching before she managed to force out a harsh whisper. "You watch your mouth." I gave a cold laugh. "I'm being very gentle. If I were to speak harshly, this family wouldn't have the face to step outside." It was the first time I had spoken to her so bluntly. No evasion, no fear, no maintaining the polite facade for someone who knew everything and still chose to cover it up. And I saw it very clearly in her eyes then. It was no longer the look of contempt for her daughter-in-law. It was fear. Fear that I could no longer be intimidated. That very night, things escalated further. Kevin went through his wife's phone. I don't know how, but he managed to access her deleted messages and found a short line. "Back door unlocked tomorrow night. I can't take it anymore." There was no name, no saved number. But for a man crazed with suspicion, that was more than enough. He immediately tried to call the number back. The phone rang once, then went dead. A few seconds later, David's phone in the next room lit up, then also went dark. I didn't see it directly, but I heard the heavy footsteps and the sound of Kevin's bedroom door slamming shut. I knew he understood. I stood on the balcony, looking down at the yard. About half an hour later, Kevin was sitting on the back steps, chain-smoking in the darkness, his face numb and empty, like a man who had been drained of all his blood. No yelling, no breaking things. That silence was the harbinger of the biggest storm. I knew the climax was close, but I didn't want him to explode just yet. Not yet. I wanted him to see it with his own eyes, to hear it with his own ears, so that when everything fell apart, no one in that house would have the words to save each other. After that night, when Kevin sat in the yard smoking until his eyes were red, but still didn't cause a scene, I knew he hadn't calmed down. He was waiting for something more concrete. For a man like him, being cheated on was painful. But being cheated on by his own brother wasn't just pain, it was humiliation. A humiliation so profound that hearing about it wasn't enough. He had to see it with his own eyes to believe it. And I decided I would give him that sight. I chose a night with heavy rain, the kind that starts in the early evening and doesn't let up. The wind whipped against the windows, and water dripped steadily onto the metal awning over the back kitchen, making everyone in the house just want to curl up in bed and lock their doors. No one would suspect a thing. At dinner, I deliberately told my mother-in-law that I had an early business trip the next day and wanted to go to bed early to be well rested. Carol just nodded, not asking any questions. Everyone in the house was too busy hiding their own secrets to pay attention to whether I was telling the truth. To David, I sent a simple, normal text. "I'm tired, going to sleep now. If you get home late, don't wake me." I knew he would read that message over and over. And I knew that when a cheating man sees his wife willingly turn off the lights and go silent, he's likely to think he's in the clear. But the more important message, the one I sent to Kevin, was just one sentence, with no context. "If you want to know the truth, don't sleep tonight. 11 o'clock, back staircase." I didn't explain further. I didn't need to. For a man who had been eaten alive by suspicion for days, that one line was enough to keep him awake. At 10 minutes to 11, all the lights in the house were off. My mother-in-law had gone to her room early, and the only light in the hallway was a dim glow from the bathroom at the end. I quietly slipped into the storage closet next to the kitchen, just as I had before. I opened the camera feed and set my phone to record. The rain outside was getting heavier, beating on the metal awning with a rhythmic drumming, as if providing a soundtrack for the drama about to unfold. My heart pounded, but my mind was strangely calm. I knew that after tonight, nothing could be saved. At exactly 11, David's bedroom door opened. He was barefoot, his steps light, as if he were all too familiar with sneaking around his own home. 2 minutes later, Jessica's door opened. She was wearing only a thin robe over her nightgown, her hair down, and she moved so quickly she almost tripped on the last step. The moment they met at the bottom of the back staircase, they fell into each other's arms, as if they couldn't bear it for another second. There was no more caution, no more pretense of being family. It was the desperate, frantic embrace of two people who had been repressed for too long. Jessica pressed her face into David's chest, her words choked with sobs but still clear. "I don't want to hide like this anymore. I'm so tired of being your sister-in-law in the morning and your woman at night." Hearing that, a chill ran down my spine. Some words, when they are only suspicions, hurt in one way. But when you hear them spoken from the person's own mouth, the humiliation is something else entirely. David gripped her shoulders, his voice hoarse. "Just get through this, and I'll tell everyone everything. I can't live like this anymore either." He had just finished his sentence when a tremendous crash echoed from the back kitchen door. The door had been kicked open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Kevin burst in like a crazed animal, his eyes bloodshot, his hair soaked with rain. In his hand, he had grabbed a plastic chair from the patio. He let out a roar so loud I thought the roof would shake. "Keep talking. I'm listening." Jessica screamed and stumbled backward, while David let go of her, his face drained of all color. But it was too late. This time, it wasn't a story, it wasn't a suspicion. Kevin had seen it with his own eyes, his own brother, holding his wife in the middle of the night, in their own home. A second later, he lunged forward, swinging the plastic chair and bringing it down hard on David's shoulder. The sound of plastic hitting bone was a sickening thud. David staggered back, hitting the edge of a table. Jessica tried to intervene but was slapped so hard she fell to the wet kitchen floor. He screamed as he kicked over a bucket of water, sending it splashing across the tiles. "You could have slept with anyone, but you slept with my brother? And you," he pointed at David, "are you a man or a dog?" At first, David retreated, but when he was cornered, he too went into a frenzy, tackling his younger brother. The two men wrestled on the wet floor, knocking over a basket of vegetables and a stack of clean dishes. The sound of their curses, the screech of furniture, and Jessica's shrill sobs mixed with the drumming of the rain, creating a suffocating chaos. I stood in the darkness, watching it all unfold, like a house that had been rotting for so long, just waiting for a single push to collapse. My mother-in-law came rushing down the stairs. The moment she saw the scene, she shrieked, "Stop it! The neighbors will hear." That very sentence was like pouring gasoline on the fire. Kevin, who was holding his brother by the collar, spun around to face his mother, a twisted, insane smile on his face. "Even now, all you care about is the neighbors? You knew all along, didn't you?" Carol stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs. Her momentary hesitation was all the answer he needed. This mother wasn't shocked, wasn't hurt by the revelation. She was just terrified of it being exposed. And at that exact moment, I stepped out of my hiding place. None of the four of them had expected me to be there. I held up my phone, the screen still glowing red from recording, and my voice was ice cold. "You don't need to ask anymore. Your mother knew. I knew. You were just the last one to be kept in the dark." The moment I finished speaking, all four of them froze. David looked at me as if he were seeing a complete stranger. Jessica's face turned ashen, her lips trembling, knowing that her last escape route was gone. That night, that house was no longer a home. It was a cage, trapping four people tearing each other apart over the filth they had created. But in my heart, I was strangely calm. Because I knew that catching them in the act was only the beginning. It would only break the family from the inside. But I wasn't done. I wanted to tear off the masks they wore in public, in front of their relatives, in front of the world, so that no one could ever call this family respectable again. After that night, the house felt like it had been drained of all life. David had a gash on his forehead from hitting the table, his cheek swollen from his brother's punch. Kevin had a bruised eye and scraped knuckles, and he sat slumped on the floor, still trembling as if from a fever. Jessica huddled in a corner of the kitchen, her hair a mess, her arms wrapped around her knees, occasionally letting out a choked sob before falling silent again. And my mother-in-law, Carol, leaned against the doorframe, her face ashen, her lips trembling, looking like someone who had just watched her entire world burn to the ground. No one slept that night. They sat in different parts of the house, watching each other, as if afraid that if they turned their backs, someone would grab a knife, hang themselves, or run out into the street and do something reckless. As for me, I sat on the porch swing, listening to the rain that had finally softened to a drizzle. The turmoil in my heart had subsided. It's a strange thing. After you've experienced the absolute peak of pain, you can enter a state of cold clarity. No more tears, no more desire to scream, just a steely resolve. Near dawn, my mother-in-law knocked on my door. She stood outside, her voice hoarse. "Sarah, come in. I need to talk to you." I followed her into her bedroom. As soon as the door closed, she stood with her back to me for a long time, as if trying to swallow the humiliation stuck in her throat. Then she turned around, her eyes red, but her voice still held a trace of its usual authority. "Tell me what you want. Things have come to this. I'm begging you, don't make this a bigger scandal. It's too shameful." I looked at her for a long time. This woman had spent years lecturing me about being patient, about being proper, about upholding the family's honor. Now, when her own son was sleeping with his brother's wife, the first thing she thought of was the shame it would bring in front of others. I asked her slowly, enunciating each word. "Are you ashamed because your son slept with his sister-in-law, or are you ashamed because other people found out?" She opened her mouth to speak, but then froze. My question had stripped away the veneer of morality she had always worn. And then, something I never would have believed possible happened. She knelt. The woman who had always looked down on me, who saw herself as the matriarch of a respectable family, was now kneeling at my feet, begging me to stay silent. But seeing her like that, I felt no pity. All I could see was the image of her pulling Jessica into the storage closet to hide her. The image of her telling David to be careful. The image of her yelling at Kevin to be quiet for fear of the neighbors. She wasn't kneeling because she was sorry. She was kneeling because she was afraid of losing face. She sobbed, her words broken. "I was wrong, I was so wrong. But David is still your husband. Please, save him. If this gets out, he'll lose everything." I laughed. A dry, hollow sound that felt foreign even to me. "He's sleeping with his brother's wife, and you're still thinking about saving him? What about me? What about Kevin? What about the honor you forced others to uphold for your family?" She covered her face and cried, her shoulders shaking. But her tears no longer moved me. Some tears come too late, they only make you feel tired. At that moment, a loud crash came from the front of the house, followed by the sound of the gate being pulled open. I went out first. Jessica was dressed, a small suitcase in her hand. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a strange mix of desperation and recklessness. David shot up from his chair and blocked her path. "Where are you going?" Jessica shoved his hand away, her voice choked but sharp as a knife. "I'm going back to my mother's house. Am I supposed to stay here and let you all strangle me?" Kevin, who was still sitting on the steps, looked up, his face gray, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep. Before he could say anything, Jessica turned and looked at everyone in the family, then threw out a sentence like a bomb. "I'm pregnant. You can't hide this even if you wanted to." The entire family froze. I saw my mother-in-law's hand, which had been clutching a pillar for support, slide down. David went white, his mouth hanging open, unable to form a word. And Kevin looked as if someone had driven a nail through his forehead. He sat there for 2 seconds, then shot up, stumbled, and slammed his head against the doorframe with a sickening thud. He screamed like an animal being skinned alive. "If that baby is his, I will kill him." It was no longer a threat. It was the cry of a man who had just been buried alive by his own family. David ran after Jessica, grabbing for her suitcase, but she ripped it away, her eyes blazing. "Don't touch me. You promised and promised. What have you turned me into in this house?" Then she turned to Kevin, a twisted smile on her face as tears streamed down her cheeks. "You want to know the truth? You never once treated me like a wife, so don't you dare act like a husband now." With that, she dragged her suitcase out the gate. David started to follow, but I stopped him with a single sentence. "Go on. Go play the part of the lover." He froze. And that hesitation was more humiliating for him than a slap. The news of the pregnancy turned a sordid affair into something monstrous. If Jessica was really pregnant, whose child was it? That one question was enough to kill the last shred of morality in that house. It was no longer just about an affair. It was a tangled nest of snakes. But strangely, in that moment of chaos, my mind became clearer than ever. I knew this had gone beyond the kitchen, beyond a fistfight, beyond one night of catching them. If I stopped here, they would find a way to cover it up again. There would be pleas, excuses, closed-door family meetings. And in a little while, the world would only hear rumors, and the one left with the deepest shame would still be me. No, I would not let it all die in this yard. I immediately thought of the upcoming Thanksgiving dinner. The entire extended family would be there, hosted at David's uncle's large house. For someone like my mother-in-law, who lived for her reputation, the greatest pain wouldn't be a fight at home. It would be being exposed in front of her relatives. In front of the very people she had spent a lifetime trying to impress to maintain her good name. It was then I knew what my next step had to be. 2 days later, David came to my room one last time. He looked haggard, his eyes sunken, a layer of stubble on his chin. He stood at my door for a long time before speaking, his voice hoarse. "I'm begging you, Sarah. No matter how much you hate me, don't take this public. I'll agree to a divorce, I'll move out, but please don't ruin my entire life." I looked at the man who had been my husband and felt nothing. "Your life was ruined the moment you climbed into bed with your sister-in-law. I'm just the one opening the door for everyone to see." Hearing that, his expression changed. The pleading look vanished, replaced by a long-suppressed aggression. He gritted his teeth. "Don't push people too far. If it comes to it, we'll all go down together." I stepped closer to him, my voice slow and clear. "I already went down the night I saw you holding her. I'm the one who survived, and I'm not afraid of you anymore." That made him take a step back. After he left, I sat down at my desk and reviewed everything I had, the videos, the recordings, the text messages, the timeline. I didn't need to explain, I didn't need to tell a long story. I would let the truth speak for itself. One final blow, delivered once, and it would be enough to ensure that family would never hold their heads high again. Thanksgiving Day arrived like a long-awaited appointment. From early afternoon, Uncle Robert's sprawling house was filled with people. The aunts wore nice sweaters, whispering to their children to behave. The uncles arranged folding tables and chairs, setting out drinks and appetizers. In that festive atmosphere, my husband's family still tried to play their part as the respectable, picture-perfect unit. My mother-in-law had woken up extra early, sitting in front of the mirror to apply a bit of makeup, trying to hide her pale, haggard face. But no matter how hard she tried, the haunted look from the past few days was impossible to conceal. David wore a long-sleeved shirt despite the warm house, likely to cover the bruises from his brother's fists. Kevin's face was dark and gloomy, his eyes sunken. The moment he arrived, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and downed it in one gulp. As for me, I chose a simple, dark outfit. No makeup. I just wanted to look clear-headed and cold. When the dinner was finally served and everyone sat down to eat, laughing and talking as they did every year, I watched them and felt a bitterness that was almost nauseating. That family was rotten to the core, yet they still insisted on putting a glossy coat of paint on it for the world to see. My mother-in-law even turned to an aunt and forced a smile. My family is doing just fine. We all still love each other very much. I heard that and felt a lump of disgust in my throat. They loved each other so much they slept together in the dark and dragged their entire family into a pit, and they still had the audacity to use the word love. I sat quietly, waiting for the perfect moment. It came when Uncle Robert, the respected elder of the family, clinked his glass to make a toast. On a day like Thanksgiving, it's important to remember family unity and harmony, to set an example for the younger generation. Hearing that, I knew it was time. I put my wine glass down and stood up slowly. The room fell quiet. The first person to look up was my mother-in-law. I saw the color drain from her face instantly. I stood up straight, my voice not loud, but every word was clear and sharp. I apologized to our elders, to all my aunts and uncles. I know it's wrong to bring this up on a day like today. But if I stay silent, I feel I would be wronging both myself and everyone sitting here. That opening was enough to silence the entire room. No one was eating anymore, no one was talking. The football game muted on the TV seemed to fade away. My mother-in-law hissed, her voice trembling, "Sarah, sit down." But I didn't. I took out my phone, looked around the room, and continued, "I want to ask, in front of the entire family, does a respectable family accept a brother-in-law sleeping with his sister-in-law, a mother-in-law who knows and covers it up, and a betrayed wife who is forced to swallow her humiliation and live with it?" A fork clattered to the floor. An aunt clutched her chest. The men at the back tables turned to stare. My mother-in-law's face was as white as a sheet. David shot up, about to lunge at me to grab my phone, but Kevin was faster. He stood up, grabbed his brother by the collar, and yanked him back, hissing through clenched teeth, "Sit down and listen. Today, everyone is going to listen." That was the final nail in the coffin. I knew no one could stop it now. I played the video of the two shadows embracing under the stairs, showing it to the people closest to me first. When I saw their faces change, I turned up the volume on the audio recording. In the middle of the crowded dining room, the words I had heard in the dark echoed with chilling clarity. "Just a little longer, and I'll tell everyone." Then came Jessica's choked voice. "I'm so tired of being your sister-in-law in the morning and your woman at night." Each word was a slap in the face to the family's so-called honor. An uncle slammed his hand on the table. The aunts gasped, their eyes wide. Uncle Robert's face turned beet red, and he roared, "Disgraceful. What kind of sick joke is this?" Hearing that, my mother-in-law seemed to lose her mind. She lunged at me, trying to snatch my phone, screaming through her tears, "She's lying. She's trying to ruin us." I stepped back, avoiding her grasp, and played another video. This time, no words were needed. The entire room heard Carol's own panicked voice from that night. "Are you two insane? Do you want to destroy this entire family?" That one sentence choked off any possibility of denial. My mother-in-law froze, her legs seeming to give out from under her. She was no longer the victim. She was an accomplice, unmasked in front of her entire family. At that moment, Kevin truly lost it. He kicked over his chair and launched himself at David, punching him relentlessly right there at the table. "You're my brother, and you did this to me?" David fought back, screaming like a cornered animal. "You were never man enough to keep your own wife." That was like throwing fuel on the fire. Kevin roared and charged again. The relatives had to swarm them, pulling them apart. People were grabbing arms, holding them back, yelling. But the final blow had yet to land. In the middle of the chaos, there was a commotion in the hallway. Everyone turned. Jessica was standing there, pale, her hair hastily tied back, a folded piece of ultrasound paper in her hand. She walked into the middle of the room, her lips trembling, and said, her voice barely a whisper, "No more hiding. I'm 8 weeks pregnant, and the baby is David's." If the room had been hit by an explosion before, this was the final, devastating blow that leveled everything. An elderly great-aunt nearly fainted. An uncle stumbled backward, muttering, "Oh my God." Uncle Robert, his voice hoarse with rage, pointed to the front door. "Get out. All 3 of you, get the hell out of my house. Don't bring this sickness under my roof." I stood there, amidst the curses, my mother-in-law's wails, David's desperate attempts to explain, and Kevin's screams of blind rage, and I felt a strange emptiness. There was no triumph, no satisfaction. Just a cold, hollow space. Because in that moment, I understood with perfect clarity. This house had finally, truly fallen. But I hadn't been the one to knock it down. They had built it with lies and then kicked it over with their own desires. After that day, the house that had once been called a respectable family ceased to exist in any meaningful way. No one spoke of it directly, but everyone in the extended family understood. The averted gazes, the conversations that stopped mid-sentence whenever my former in-laws appeared, it was all the answer needed. The honor that my mother-in-law had guarded like her life had finally shattered, not because of an outsider, but because of the very secrets she had tried to hide within her own home. Uncle Robert didn't need to say much. His one, decisive statement was enough. Settle your own mess. You're not welcome back here. It was a quiet decree, but it severed the last thread of social standing my mother-in-law had clung to. For a person who had lived her entire life for the approval of her relatives, being cast out by them was a pain that seeped into her bones. Kevin didn't wait another day. That very night, he drove Jessica back to her parents' house, all pretense of dignity gone. I wasn't there, but I heard later that he placed the divorce papers on the table and said only one thing: "You didn't just make me lose a wife. You completely humiliated me as a man." David didn't escape the consequences either. The story spread naturally, from one person to the next, until it became common gossip in their community. The professional connections that had once supported him began to distance themselves. Eventually, his company called him in for a meeting and gently suggested he take some time off to get his personal life in order. Everyone knew what that meant. Some stains on your reputation never wash out. My mother-in-law, once a woman who lectured everyone on family values, now barely left her house. I went back one last time to pick up a few remaining things and saw her sitting alone in the yard, her graying hair unkempt, her eyes vacant, like someone who had lost everything. She muttered to herself, "How did it come to this?" I stood there for a moment, then turned and walked away. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because the answer was something she had known all along. Jessica was left with nowhere to turn. Her own family couldn't shelter her forever after such a public scandal. She sent me a long text message, saying she had only made one mistake, that she had been lonely and neglected and had fallen into the affair out of desperation. I read it, then deleted it. Some apologies aren't for the person you hurt, they're for yourself. I didn't need to hear it. As for me, I ended things cleanly. I filed for divorce, providing all the necessary evidence to ensure it was a swift process. There were no arguments, no begging, no demands beyond what was rightfully mine. On the day we signed the papers, David sat across from me, silent for a long time. He looked at me as if searching for a trace of the wife he once knew. Then he asked softly, "Was there never a single moment you felt any softness for me?" I looked him straight in the eye and answered slowly, "There was. But you used it all up." The day I moved out of that house, the weather was gray and still. A quiet afternoon, with a light breeze that felt like a final, silent closing of a chapter. I took my clothes, my books, the few small things I had bought for myself over the years. Most importantly, I took with me the self-respect I had managed to salvage. I didn't look back. Not because there was nothing to remember, but because what I was leaving behind was no longer worthy of a place in my memory. A few months later, I heard updates through mutual acquaintances. Jessica had a miscarriage after a severe argument. David moved into a small apartment, his career in shambles. Kevin moved to another state, cutting off almost all contact with his family. And my mother-in-law fell truly ill, not from age, but from the weight of the family she had tried to hold together at any cost, only to watch it collapse in the most painful way possible. And me? I rented a small apartment and started over. I went to work, came home, cooked for myself, and cleaned my own space. The same tasks that I had once performed with a sense of duty and quiet resentment now felt light and liberating. There were nights, lying alone, when I would remember that moment standing outside the brightly lit office door, holding a container of food, my heart feeling like it had stopped. But it was different now. The memory no longer brought a sharp, twisting pain. It just felt like a storm I had walked through. After everything, I understood one thing with perfect clarity. Betrayal is painful, but what truly breaks a person is not the act itself, but being forced to stay silent to cover it up. I didn't leave because I was weak. I left because I refused to remain in a place where right and wrong were inverted, where evil was protected, and where the victim was told to be patient. And sometimes, walking away from the wreckage isn't about losing. It's the only way to save yourself.